Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to Wednesday's episode of the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. And we're going to do another segment of Who Would You Rather? And let's get after it right away.
You're Locked On Fantasy Hockey, your daily podcast on fantasy hockey. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome back to the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. I'm your host, Steele Roden, flying solo for today's episode. And we got a lot to talk about. We're going to get into DFS, our first daily fantasy segment of this year. We're going to take a look at the 2-game board for Wednesday night, as well as, of course, our big time bets. But we're going to start off with another Who Would You Rather between Minnesota Wild forward Matt Zuccarello and Edmonton Oilers forward Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. I think this one's very, very close. So I'm very excited to see what everyone out there who's tuning in, what your thoughts, and who would you choose between Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Matt Zuccarello. Let me know in the comments, DM us on Twitter, who you would rather for your fantasy hockey team. But we're going to dive into that to start off today's episode. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins and Matt Zuccarello have had a little bit of different starts to the fantasy year and their NHL career this 2022-23 season. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, one of those guys, very inconsistent to start the season. Same with Matt Zuccarello, actually, but let's take a look at their stats overall. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins at this point, 5 goals, 7 assists, 28 shots on net, 9 hits, and 5 blocks. For Zuccarello, he's also got 5 goals, 7 assists, 31 shots, 5 hits, and 4 blocks. And I really like the comparison of these two forwards because, I know every single league is different the way they record the stats and record point systems, whether it's points head-to-head or categorical stats, categorical matchups as well. But going based off of my fantasy league that I'm in, these guys are in the top 10 for fantasy points so far this year. Ryan Nugent-Hopkins is at 31.80 fantasy points so far, and Matt Zuccarello is right behind him in 10th spot with 29.80 fantasy points on the season. These guys have had very eerily similar stats throughout their entire career. Zuccarello was coming off a career-high 79 points last season, while Ryan Nugent-Hopkins' career high back from 2018, I believe, was 69 points for him. So over the span of their career so far, these guys put up very, very similar stats. So I really want to dive into these two players and who you would rather take on the fantasy team. They're very close in comparison. That's why I've chosen them for today's episode. And I'm going with Matt Zuccarello. And I really, of course, it's very close, but I think Zuccarello overall has been more consistent. Like I said, the way their stats end up at the end of the season, they're very consistent with putting up towards 150 to 170 shots every year, 30 to 40 blocks, 30 to 40 hits for those two guys who are on the smaller size of players in the league, so they don't throw their body and they don't get in front of many shots throughout the season, but nonetheless, they put up a decent amount of points. And I think a lot of people out there would rather Ryan Nugent-Hopkins because he plays with he plays alongside with the best player in the NHL and then another player who's probably in the top 3. It's really up for debate, maybe top 5 as well, depending where you put McKinnon, Matthews, and Makar at this point. But Leon Draisaitl as well is one of the best players in the league right now and continues to show why he's in the top 3 for me in consideration. A lot of people would go with Nugent-Hopkins because of that fact, playing along those two guys. But again, he, besides playing on the first power play, he does move around the lineup quite a bit. Obviously he's on the first line as of right now, but I've seen him been on the second line and even drop down to the third line when things aren't going proper for him. And for me, I'd rather have Matt Zuccarello on my line. I think him staying on the first line consistently with Kirill Kaprizov and whoever's in the center position for the Minnesota Wild. At this point, it looks like it's Frederick Gaudreau. It used to be Ryan Hartman, but he got dropped down because he wasn't playing well. He's now out with injury as well. So for me, I would rather have Matt Zuccarello. They both have the same points. They're both very similar with the shots, the blocks, the hit, the power play points, special team points as well. But over the span of the entire season, Matt Zuccarello will put up more points, even at the beginning of the season. Flip's not here for today's episode, but I think he would have to agree at this point too that he would rather Matt Zuccarello as well. He actually had Ryan Nugent-Hopkins on his team, ended up dropping him after the first 4, maybe even the first 5 games of the season because he hadn't recorded a point yet. And then right after he dropped him, he goes out and puts up a 4-point night. And he's currently at 12 points, maybe 13 points to start the season as well. So he's picked it up as of late, but I would rather have Matt Zuccarello. The chemistry he has with Kirill Kaprizov, just being able to bounce back and forth with him, like I mentioned before on many, many episodes, it looks like he has eyes in the back of the head. He knows where his teammates, especially Kirill Kaprizov, is going to be at all times on the ice, and he's able to find him backdoor, on the hash marks, in the slot, wherever, even if he's covered by forwards or defensemen, defending in the defensive zone. Matt Zuccarello is just one of those guys that can just find his teammates no matter where he is on the ice. His vision, the way he's able to thread the needle sometimes and just slide the puck along through people's skates, under sticks, and still get it through to his target is unbelievable in my opinion. And even though, like I said, these two guys are very, very similar in stats and put up very similar stats over the span of their career, I'm leaning towards Matt Zuccarello, but let me know who you're leaning to between these two guys on who would you rather for another segment of this. Leave some comments on the YouTube video, DM us on Twitter. If you don't agree with my insight, my input on who would you rather, let me know about that too and why you would take Ryan Nugent-Hopkins. Like I said before, I really like talking to all the listeners and fans out there, having a conversation because I learn things too along the way. It's not just me that's the expert out here. A lot of you out there know what you're talking about, and we're seeing that in the fantasy-based Locked On Hockey Fantasy League as well. So leave some comments, DM us on Twitter. Really appreciate getting back to us. But right now, we're going to pause this episode, pause the podcast. We're paused? Okay, great. Because I really need to talk to you about Built Bar's new reimagined flavors, cookie dough topper, coconut brownie bar, and coconut brownie topper as well. White chocolate peppermint granola. It's Built's take on granola bars, so it's more filling and still insanely delicious. And there's also a candy cane brownie puff. Built Puffs are like biting into the universe's most delicious cloud. Yes, the Built Puffs, the Built Bars are absolutely phenomenal. I love the fact that they send it to me. I get to try all these new flavors. They're absolutely spectacular. First off, for anyone who hasn't tried Built Bars before, they're literally the best tasting protein bars ever built. Pun intended. They're revolutionizing nutrition as we know it with 100% real chocolate, 17 grams of protein, and shockingly low sugar and calories. Only 130 calories in the Built Bars and Built Puffs. So go to BuiltBar.com, get 15% off your order right now by using the code LOCKEDON15 at Built.com. I'll say that one more time. Get 15% off your order right now by using the code LOCKEDON15 at Built.com. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. For your next listen, though, go check out Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you so much for tuning in for today's episode. Make sure you hit the subscribe and the follow button. We really do appreciate that. We just hit over 600 subscribers. Let's continue that trend. Get to 700 by the new year. So share this with your friends out there. Obviously you don't want to try and help them beat you in any fantasy matchups, but this is a great podcast. You get a ton of information for many, many topics. So share it with your friends and family members out there. And again, thank you so much for tuning in. Let's get into the DFS segment for today. Daily fantasy, our first time talking about daily fantasy this season on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey podcast. And I don't think it comes at a better time than a 2-game board. So there's not much to go out there except for these 2 games. The Philadelphia Flyers taking on the Toronto Maple Leafs. We talked about that on a couple episodes ago. That was a big rant for us between Flip and I. Obviously coming from Toronto, the city of Toronto, it hits home, it hits the heart a lot. So we had to vent a little bit. But the second game on the schedule, the Pittsburgh Penguins taking on the Buffalo Sabres. So there's only two matchups, 4 teams to choose from for your daily fantasy target. And as much as this pains me to say, I am targeting the Toronto Maple Leafs. And there's a big reason why. First reason, the Philadelphia Flyers are playing the second of a back-to-back. They just finished playing yesterday against the New York Rangers, where that was a great game. You don't see a lot of zeros going in to the third period, but the New York Rangers won 1-0 in overtime. Carter Hart yet again standing on his head, playing fantastic to start the season for the Philadelphia Flyers, but it's the second of a back-to-back. So that means Felix Sandstrom will be in net for the Philadelphia Flyers. He's lost both of his games that he started in so far this season. And again, the second reason why I'm targeting the Toronto Maple Leafs, they seem to switch gears after a terrible start in the month of October. We've seen that the last few years for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Once it hits November, they go on an absolute tear. Last year, I believe they were 12-2-0 in the month of November, so I'm expecting them to start the same way. We've heard it from a lot of their superstars that they're not upset, they're not nervous, they haven't lost their confidence. They started the same way last year. Mitch Marner said that, and they know how good this team is. So I expect them to turn things around, starting with the Philadelphia Flyers. And there's 3 guys that I'm targeting from the Toronto Maple Leafs. Obviously, the first guy, Austin Matthews. He's going to be upwards of $8,500 for your daily fantasy if you're on DraftKings. I'm also targeting Michael Bunting, $3,500 for him. He hasn't been great of late, but eventually he's going to have to turn it around, playing on the first 2 lines and, playing alongside Matthews, Marner, Tavares, and Nylander, whoever he's playing with. He needs to turn things around for himself as well. And what better way to start in the month of November against the Philadelphia Flyers. I'm also taking Morgan Riley on the back end for the Toronto Maple Leafs because he's a juggernaut on the power play. He's got 7, maybe 8 points on the season so far. He's going to be upwards of $5,000 as well for DraftKings as well. But those are the 3 players I'm targeting from the Toronto Maple Leafs because I'm targeting a lot more players from the Buffalo Sabres standpoint. Tage Thompson, Jeff Skinner, Owen Power, Eric Comrie. Hopefully he's in net. If not, Craig Anderson, Dylan Cousins. Those are the 5 players I'm targeting. And the most expensive one of them, and you're getting a ton of value out of this, Tage Thompson, who's coming off a 6-point night after the Buffalo Sabres won 8-3 against the Detroit Red Wings. $6,500 for Tage Thompson, $5,000 for Jeff Skinner, only $2,800 for Owen Power. Dylan Cousins, $3,600 as well. You can get a ton of value for Dylan Cousins because he's a gritty player and he's got 4 goals, 2 assists on the season. I'm targeting the Buffalo Sabres. They've looked great the last 3 games at home. Obviously, like I mentioned, an 8-3 win against the Detroit Red Wings, but the last 3 games at home, they've looked fantastic. They've looked fantastic to start the season as well. They're 6-3-0. They're in the top of the Atlantic Division, right behind the Boston Bruins and Florida Panthers. And they're taking on the Pittsburgh Penguins, who another team that is playing their second of a back-to-back as well. And they just let one slip away right through their fingers against the Boston Bruins. They were up 5-2 against the Boston Bruins heading into the third period. Bruins come storming back, win it in overtime, 6-5. And that's a tough loss for the Pittsburgh Penguins, who I now believe have lost 5 games in a row. And I don't think it gets any better for them in the month of November and against the Buffalo Sabres on the road to continue this very long road trip for them as well. But the Buffalo Sabres, the Toronto Maple Leafs, those are the two teams I'm targeting. I've mentioned the players, all of those. I've already searched it up. I've done it myself. All of those players you can fit into your lineup, as well as Jake Gensel, who I believe was 72, maybe 7,300. And he's probably the only player that I would be able to afford on the Pittsburgh Penguins. Maybe someone a little less, but at that point, you're just wasting some money there. So Jake Gensel, a phenomenal player as well, who's played great when he's in the lineup. But I'm taking the Buffalo Sabres and the Toronto Maple Leafs. I think for the Maple Leafs, they turn it around in the month of November. And the Buffalo Sabres are just really, really strong right now. And both those teams, the Flyers and the Penguins, are playing the second of a back-to-back. With that being said, we're going to get over to the big, or I'm going to get over to the big time bets very, very shortly. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. Don't forget, we are free and available on all podcast platforms, which also includes YouTube. Like I mentioned, we just surpassed over 600 subscribers. So please make sure you continue to hit the subscribe, hit the follow button. We really do appreciate it here on the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast. With that being said, let's continue over to the big time bets segment. Every single day on this podcast, every episode, we will finish each episode with the big time bets. And we have turned it around as of late. The locks of the night for me have been hitting. I still have a below 500 record overall, but nonetheless, the locks of the night have been hitting for me. With that being said, 2 games on the board. Like I mentioned before, I'm going to be taking the Leafs on the money line. As of right now, the money line is minus 315. I think that's very, very low. Before game time, it should change. I'm not sure why it's minus 315. Maybe it's because the Flyers are playing that second of a back-to-back, but nonetheless, the Flyers have been way better than the Toronto Maple Leafs. So the fact that they're that big of favorites, I get they're at home, but still, minus 315. Nonetheless, I'm taking the Leafs on the money line. I don't think the Flyers win with Felix Sandstrom in net. I do think this will be a high-scoring game. So if you want to take the over, I believe the over 7 goals is at plus 110 right now. I could see this being a very high-scoring game. And finally, the Leafs cracking over 4 goals in a game for the first time this season. I'm also going to take the Sabres on the money line, plus 110. At plus 110, that's some great odds right there. Casey DeSmith will be in net for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Again, like I mentioned, the Sabres have looked great so far this entire season. Even in the games they've lost, they've still played very, very great as well. The final pick I have for tonight, Austin Matthews, anytime goal. We saw him score against the Anaheim Ducks, against the San Jose Sharks. He's finally turning it on. He's finally putting the puck behind the net. I think he continues that against a very weak Felix Sandstrom, who hasn't looked great every single start that he's been in the 2 games that he's played. So I'm taking Matthews anytime goal. The odds for that aren't out yet, but I believe they should be pretty juicy as well. The Sabres on the money line at plus 110, but of course the lock of the night, the Leafs on the money line, minus 315 as of now. But I do believe that will change prior to game time. Those are the 3 bets of the night. We will hear Flip's 3 bets and his lock of the night on Twitter. So make sure you're checking out our Twitter account, following us on our own personal Twitter accounts, because that's where a lot of our bets come in as well. If you want to hear Flip's picks, go to Twitter to check them out. I will be posting mine again today at some point before the games start. Thank you so much for making the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast your first listen every single day. For your second listen, though, again, go check out Locked On Sports Today podcast. They're doing phenomenal things on the podcast. Great podcast to tune into. The biggest stories, plus instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available again on the Odyssey app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcast platforms. Thanks so much for tuning in for today's solo podcast with Steele Roden. Have a great day. Good luck with all your bets out there. Hopefully we're bringing in some money for you guys on our lock of the night and our bets of the night as well. And with that being said, we shall see you back here again tomorrow. Peace.